You guys want some coffee or something? It's the partitions that we use for the exhibition, al-ma'rad. Yeah, so we have to take them to storage, inshallah. No, they're supposed to go away. أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين الصلاة والسلام على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. I begin in the name of Almighty Allah. I invoke His peace and blessings upon our beloved Prophet Muhammad sallallahu alaihi wasallam. I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to extend His blessings to the Prophet's family and his companions and the men and women that walk in their footsteps, and I ask Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to make us among them. Allahumma ameen. Jazakallah khair for joining us, brothers and sisters. This is the Tafseerah program. And tonight, inshallah, is session number 3 of Surat Al-Nisa. This is a very important surah. It's a surah of laws and rules and regulations. It's a surah that was revealed in the interim period of peace between year 6 and year 8 after Hijrah, after the migration of Muslims from Mecca to Medina. Immediately after the Treaty of Hudaybiyah, the Truce of Hudaybiyah, that basically brought much needed peace to Arabia at the time. And the Prophet ﷺ was able to send his emissaries and ambassadors and messengers to heads of state and chieftains in order to invite them to Islam. So that was a great opportunity for strong diplomatic relations. But also it was an opportunity for the community to look inwards and to address some of the lingering challenges and problems that community may have had to deal with. And some of those matters were kind of put on hold so that when the time comes and there is relative peace, those matters are addressed. Surah Al-Nisa is the second largest surah in the Quran, the second longest. And therefore, by extension, has to be really important. This is a placeholder of a plethora of rules and regulations and laws that must be observed. And I said before that the essential theme of Surah Al-Nisa is equity towards the vulnerable groups. Again, I stated before that a society that fails to address the needs of the weakest and the most vulnerable is a society that will neither grow nor last. Those are the civilizations that will erode and die, very slowly. Civilizations that only cater to the needs of the powerful and the wealthy, and the majority are societies that, again, will fail to last. A society is judged by its capacity to be equitable, not only to those who have power, but also the powerless. Because people of power, they always have the strength to defend themselves and to take what is theirs. If you have a society where the powerful gets their due rights, that doesn't really say anything. It just states who the powerful is and what they're capable of doing. But a society that creates systems of laws and regulations, and a system of personal piety that inspires that society to protect the rights of those who are weak and vulnerable is a society that seems to have the right factors for survival and for thriving. And some of the examples of those minority or vulnerable groups, we talked about the orphans, we talked about as-sufaha, the foolish, or people who have not, don't have the mental capacity to make legal decisions. We talked about minorities, we talked about refugees, we talked about captives of war. And we talked about women, and it's interesting because a surah about equity towards the vulnerable groups is named after women, because women is a fascinating case. Women numerically are not a minority, yet they are always treated as a minority, and they experience the vulnerabilities of a minority in almost every society. And so women become emblematic of this exploitation of minorities, so to speak. And Islam, the Quran, and definitely, specifically Surat Al-Nisa, were revealed in order to endeavor to rectify this process, right? And if again, when you think about it, if women constitute 50% of society, yet they are still subjected to harm and injustice and inequity, then what does that say about the people who are actually small in numbers, right? Like if we fail to protect 50% of society, then we're not going to be able to protect the small minority groups, right? And so it becomes a litmus test of success. If we can address the rights of women, if we can address the exploitations and the abuse that take place to women, then we can then address all the other segments of society that may be considered vulnerable. And so I said that this surah was revealed between the Treaty of Hudaybiyah and the conquest of Mecca, at least most of it. Some parts of the surah were revealed later, but at least we know that the majority of the surah, 95% of the surah, were revealed in those two very important years of peace. Right? Now we can take a breather. Now we don't have to worry about a conquering army coming from Quraysh. Then we can actually pay attention to our internal challenges and affairs, particularly equity and justice towards these minority groups. Thus far, in the last two sessions, we talked about our common ancestry as human beings, and this is how the surah starts. And I stated from Bukhari and Muslim, the Prophet ﷺ received this delegation from the tribe of Mudar that was extremely destitute. They were very, very poor, and that the Prophet ﷺ himself was so offended at the sight of this, and organized this fundraiser where the community, mostly the Ansar, donated a lot. Those refugees, again a representation of this minority group, those refugees were absorbed by the community. They were housed. They were given, shelter. They were given food. They were given clothes, and later given opportunity for employment and so forth. And the city of Medina is not alien to this concept. The absorption of refugee groups. That's what Medina does to this day. That is what Medina does. Ya أيها الناس اتقوا ربكم الذي خلقكم من نفس واحدة. O people, beware of your Lord, or be conscious of your Lord that has created you from a single soul. We're all brothers and sisters. We're all cousins in the end. And so the boundaries that we create, the artificial boundaries that we create in order to put ourselves above others, in order to say, I need to support my own group, my own people, my own race, my own color, my own social status or economic status. The reminder here is that you and women and men and refugees and prisoners of war and everyone, we're all just one people. And we come from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. This is contrasted with the arbitrary nature of the modern nation state, which basically suggests that this line that we draw between two parcels of land is actually legitimate and means something. And so if cousins wake up in the morning and then political realities dictated that a line is drawn between this house and that house, then this person will wake up in the morning of a different citizenship. And somewhat the modern nation state and its philosophy enhance this illusion and make it look like it's real. And so people on this side of the border, they start thinking that they are entitled to things that the other people on the other side of the border are not entitled to those same things, right? Which is a modern day anathema. And this notion, by the way, the notion of the modern nation state is going to come up again, in Surat Al-Nisa, and inshallah ta'ala I'll demonstrate to you that the backdrop against which Sharia operates does not acknowledge the boundaries of the nation state. And this is really important because, we as Muslims do not acknowledge the legitimacy of the nation state from a philosophical standpoint. I mean, I acknowledge it practically because I carry a passport of that nation state in my pocket. You can't travel anywhere in the world without the permission of a nation state. You cannot go anywhere in the world that is not under the jurisdiction of a nation state. But in reality, we as Muslims philosophically disagree with the idea of the nation state, and we aspire for a future where political realities, do not abide by the boundaries of the nation state. But again, we will talk about this a little bit more. But the point here is that whether I live on the north side of the border, and I just so happen to be the guy that was born on this side of the border, does not necessarily make me any better than the guy that was born on the southern side of the border. Right? And so when we support refugees, when we support immigrants, when we support people that grew up in difficult environments, this is not us doing them any favors. This is us, خَلَقَكُم مِّن نَفْسٍ وَاحِدَةٍ. We're all brothers. We all descend from a single soul. وَخَلَقَ مِنْهَا زَوْجَهَا, and created for it its mate. وَبَثَّ مِنْهُمَا رِجَالًا كَثِيرًا وَنِسَاءً. And from that single family unit, Adam and Eve, right, so many men and women came about, right? So it's also a reference to the importance of the family, and the family is, that unit. On one hand, we're all one human family, but on the other hand, it is the family that creates those bonds. وَاتَّقُوا اللَّهَ الَّذِي تَسَاءَلُونَ بِهِ وَالْأَرْحَامِ, and we talked about how we're supposed to be conscious of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, but also careful about our bonds of kinship, right? Because the violation of those bonds of kinship can have adverse effects. We also talked about al-yatama, the orphans, as a major minority group or a major vulnerable group, especially at the time of the Arabs. Longevity was not very common. People did not live that long. People's average age was like 30s and 40s. There was a lot of disease and a lot of exposure, a lot of warfare. So people, especially men, would die young, and then they would leave a lot of kids behind. And so, devising a process to properly address the needs of al-yatama, the orphans, was absolutely necessary. And that has not changed, by the way. It's just the labels evolved over time. I mean, we have tons and tons and tons of children, in this society, for example, that have been abandoned by their parents. So that maybe they're not orphans in the essential definition of the word, but single mothers or single fathers, where one of the parents walks out on the other parent, or people who act promiscuously. So I was just reading a couple of days ago, about this particular actor. One of the is an African American actor, and then they're celebrating that he has like 27 children, and they say in the year 2025, and I quote, he sired 5 children, sounding like we're talking about an animal or a horse. Like, this is the language that we use on horse farm. This horse sired 5 foals or whatever they call it, right? He sired 5 children in 1 year. And of course, he gives no attention to those kids. He does not raise those kids. He probably doesn't even know those kids. Because for them, it's just entertainment. It's a game. It's about pleasure, right? And so, orphans as a category, still a relevant category to this day. But particularly female orphans. Because female orphans, as the Quran stated, is a more vulnerable group. Vulnerable because they're orphans, but also vulnerable because they're girls, right? And that makes it a double jeopardy for them. And there would be like a legal guardian where the girl is raised in his household. And like I said last time, when the girl reaches a certain age, and then she's not a child anymore in the sight of this legal guardian, and he looks at her and she's beautiful, she's pretty, she's attractive, and like she's 14 now, and he's thinking, why can't I not marry this girl? And of course, there is a financial incentive for this, because he's also the manager of her wealth. She's supposed to inherit from her father or whatever who passed away, and so now he has her money, and he has an incentive not to give her that money. So the solution is just marry her, so I can absorb that wealth, and it becomes mine, right? And considering the fact that the Arabs did not have any limitation on the number of people they could marry, and what's the big deal? I'm just going to say I married this. She's going to become my 9th wife. And that's fine. Society is not going to disagree with this. I can have all of her wealth and have fun with her as well. And so, the ayat were revealed that if you are raising young orphan girls in your household and you are their legal guardian, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى, if you feel that you are not going to be fair to those orphan girls, then marry somebody else. Then you cannot marry them. If you marry them, then you have to follow the proper procedure. You have to find a wakil that is not yourself, that will vouch for you, that will give good advice to this girl. Number 2, you have to pay her mahr completely, and it has to be hers, not the wakil's, as we will see a little bit later in the surah. Number 3, you have to give her the wealth that she is owed, her inheritance, right? This has to be treated like an ordinary marriage. It cannot be treated like, I have an advantage because I'm her legal guardian, therefore I can flex my muscle and I can, tout my strength, and I can have her, with little limitations and regulations. You cannot do that. Right? So the ayah basically says, وَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تُقْسِطُوا فِي الْيَتَامَى, if you cannot honor those orphan girls that you wanted to marry, then marry somebody else up to 4. Right? فَانْكِحُوا مَا طَابَ لَكُم مِّنَ النِّسَاءِ مَثْنَى وَثُلَاثَ وَرُبَعَ. And we said here, and this is really important, because this kind of indicated the Quranic restriction of unfettered polygamy, which was the common norm in pre-Islamic times, right? It was completely uncontrolled and unregulated. Men could marry, an unlimited number of women, and they would have very, very little rights. And so up to 4 you could marry. And we talked about this last time, and I think I really went in depth, into addressing the Islamic solutions to infidelity, to cheating, to promiscuous behavior, to prostitution, to sexual freedom, and that all of this was kind of the solution was enshrined in the institution of marriage, right? You want to marry and you want to have multiple relations and you want more intimacy, sure, but it has to be done within the limitations of the boundaries of marriage, right? And I said that what Islam did is that it did not encourage men to marry more than one woman. Rather, it restricted men who already had excessive polygamous relationships and said, no, you have to bring this down to a maximum of 4. And I stated to you last time how the Prophet ﷺ would literally ask Muslim converts, how many wives do you have? And he would tell them, I have 10. He would tell them, select the 4 that you love the most, and you have to divorce 6, right? So it's not that these people were single or married to one, and then we encouraged them to marry 3 more. It's that these people were married to 10 and 15, and we said, this is ridiculous, you cannot do that. The maximum that you can have is 4. And then the qualification was given, فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدًا. Now if you're after all of this, considering all of this and having all of this in mind, remember, this is a surah about equity. It's a surah about being fair. And so if you're concerned that you still might not be equitable and fair to your wives, then you really want to stick to one. And quite honestly, if you feel that you can't be fair to one woman, then maybe you're better off being single, because you're just harming yourself and going to harm others. So, just don't put somebody else's life in jeopardy, right? Don't give some illusions and some dreams to a woman and then, kind of shatter those dreams with your actions. So, what the Quran does is that the Quran addresses legitimate biological realities. We don't stick our heads in the sand like ostriches, We don't pretend that it's not happening. We don't give people fluff. The Prophet ﷺ could have just provided people with some fluffy spirituality. Why get into those things? Why get into law? Why get into social norms? Why, poke the wasp's nest? Why get into matters that would make some people upset at you? The Prophet ﷺ, like I always say, if he was an imposter, he would have just given people what they wanted to hear. He would have not tried to upend their social realities and their social structures and give them a pill that is very difficult to swallow. These are people that are, the Arabs, by the way, I always say that the Arabs in the times of Jahiliyyah were the first anarchists. The Arabs were anarchists. They loved anarchy. They did not like organized government. They did not like rules and regulations. They would not live under a king either, right? Imri'ul Qais and those poets of pre-Islamic times actually have poems where they wrote about their own freedom and their own dignity, and we don't give allegiance and we don't pledge loyalty to kings because we're free folk. And that's why they would just live in their own tribes, move from one place to the other. They're not used to rules. The Arabs were not used to being told what to do, right? They just wanted to decide on their own reality. They were total anarchists. They did not accept government. And so what Islam is giving them is a very, very difficult to process. It's a very difficult thing to process. Islam is giving them rules and limitations and acts of piety. And ultimately, after Hijrah, is also giving them a system of government and khilafah and bay'ah and pledges of allegiance and warfare. All the things that the Arabs, for the longest time, they tried to avoid. The Arabs could have lived under organized governments if they wanted to. They could have signed treaties with the Persians or the Romans, right? And they would have become citizens of those kings. And they would have received, some type of perks in the process. But they wouldn't want any of this. And so for the Prophet ﷺ to come and tell them, no, we're not going to live like this anymore. We have to adjust all of that. That was a very difficult undertaking. And if all he wanted was power and obedience, he would have just, hey guys, don't change anything. We're just going to stay right here. I just want to be the leader of Quraysh, okay? Just give me power. And I'll give you fluffy things and sugar-coated things, and you don't have to worry about anything. The Prophet ﷺ was not, لا ينطق عن الهوى. He does not speak of his own whim. He reflects divine wisdom. And so he tells them what Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala instructs him to say. And so Islam would have not survived 1400 years as a civilizational philosophy if it did not address, number one, address those issues. Number two, address them effectively. Otherwise, it would have failed the test of time. But we've seen other systems, we've seen other philosophies, we've seen other ideologies, and we've seen them rise and fall over the centuries. The Islamic ideal seems to be the only one that remains valid and remains legitimate to this day. And it still addresses certain problems to this day. As culture fluctuates and evolves, Islam remains that one stable reality, right? And so you're looking at a reality where for thousands of years, men had many, many wives. And for thousands of years, despite the fact that they had many, many wives, they still had many, many relationships, right? Extramarital relationships. And for thousands of years, right? Men would commit acts of rape and acts of sexual exploitation. There would be prostitution. I would just want you to imagine. This is why the punishment for zina in the Quran is extremely severe. Why? Because men always had access to legitimate forms of intimacy. Why? Why do you have to do this? Why do you have to go, commit acts of infidelity and do something in haram when there are legitimate ways of doing it? That's why it's extremely, extremely severe, because you don't have an excuse, right? That is the reality that the world experienced. That's what Islam had to deal with, right? And prostitution was perfectly legitimate, even in Arab society. And you would think that the Arabs had some dignity, they would not allow this, yet they did allow it. And women would post a little red flag on their tents for men to know that, this is a brothel. And men would frequent, those places. Again, the same men that are married to 9 women would still frequent, because hey, the more the merrier, the more fun the better. So they would go on and they pay money to those prostitutes. And of course, because the prostitute, may Allah protect our families, they are having relations with many women. Ultimately, she gets pregnant, right? And so who decides who the father is? It's not the DNA test. She has to decide who the father is. So she looks at these guys and she selects maybe the most good looking or the wealthiest, and she says, oh, that's your son. You have to take care of him, right? And so now you have to harvest basically the seed of your inequities, of your transgressions, and now you have to raise someone. And it could be like, this person is very fair skinned, and then this kid is very dark skinned, and you know that this is not your child, but there's nothing that you can do about it. And then you raise a child, and you know that this is not your child. A lot of resentment, a lot of hatred, a lot of, disgust. Why am I raising this child? It's not even my child, but social norms forced you to raise this child and to support them financially and so on and so forth. And then this child may marry someone else that could actually be their sister, because we don't know who the real father is, right? And so all this was happening, and we could shrug our shoulders, and then we could pretend that it's not happening, and we could just say, why can't men stop being pigs, right? We could do that, because that's what modern society does. Why can't you just be a decent human being? Why are you such a pig? Sure, we could do that if we wanted to, but we have to ask ourselves, is this working effectively? It's not working effectively today. It did not work effectively yesterday. It never worked effectively ever, ever, ever. And then there is the question of warfare, right? There's the question of conquest. There's the question of pillaging cities and laying waste to towns. There's a question of the entire male population of that city, is either, killed in battle, or, they're in the army, so they're somewhere else. And they have an entire town that is made of women. What happened in ancient times? In ancient times, it's, sexual exploitation, murder, rape, destruction. And women were always the number one victim of war. That actually continues to be the case today. Like in the year 2026, we still hear stories about soldiers going into villages and towns, in war-torn countries, and they commit acts of rape. So we can look at all of this and pretend that it's not happening, and still, say, oh, men are pigs. Okay, yeah, they are pigs. What are we going to do about the pigs then? Are we going to legislate and create rules and laws that would regulate the behavior of pigs? Or we're just going to call them pigs and then look the other way and continue to suffer from great atrocities, right? So the Quran would not do that. The Quran would not just go into sentiment and just call people names without offering, a real solution, right? So the solution was for families that are okay with this notion and they would like to have multiple wives, let them decide. Who are we to tell them how to live and how not to live, right? And so this was the Quran's way of restricting the number of wives, but at the same time, not making it impossible to marry somebody else. And one of the examples that I gave you last time, men continue to be fertile and continue to be capable of having children well into their 80s and their 90s, if they live that long, right? But women, lose their ability to have children, to bear children in their 40s or early 50s, for the most part, right? And so it's not just that that women lose the capacity to have children, women also lose interest in intimacy. And so if a husband is 65 years old and is still interested in intimacy, and then his wife is not interested anymore, what are we saying to this man? It's okay. You have to accept it for the rest of your life. Otherwise, we're going to call you a pig, right? Or devise a practical solution that can help this family, and then they're able to decide for themselves whether they want to use that solution or not. Of course, I am not saying that every man should marry a second wife or the third wife. That's not what the Quran is saying. Many men don't want to. In fact, the majority of men would not want that. I mean, they're barely able to manage one family. They barely have enough money to support one family. They barely have enough energy to deal with one woman, right? Imagine having to have, 3 or 4 different problems and different challenges and different expectations and different households. Is very difficult for 99.9% of men. Okay. So they reach their 65 years of age, and maybe they want more, but they choose not to because it's just too much trouble, right? Let them make that decision on their own. But to rid them of the ability to choose, that would be inhumane and would be unrealistic and would certainly be un-Islamic, right? And so for that percentage of families that want to find those solutions, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala made it possible in the Quran for men to take, an additional wife if they wanted to. As long as equity is maintained and as long as adala, fairness is maintained between them. If, by the way, this is the law, this is Sharia law, right? If a second wife or a third wife goes to the judge and she's able to show that her husband does not support her the way that he supports the first one, or that her husband does not give her enough time, like he does the first or the second one, or that there is any form of injustice that is being performed, the judge will divorce them and will give her mahr in full and might actually fine, her husband as well. Right? So which would we rather have, right? To look the other way and pretend that those problems are not real and continue to have an outlook at a society that is fraught with infidelity and sexual promiscuity, or create solutions and regulations that would help that society keep itself together, right? فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدًا. If you are fearful that you may not be able to be fair, then stick with one, right? And that seems like almost the norm. Like monogamous relationships in the world today seem like they are the norm, and polygamous relationships are the exception. Having said that, families need to decide on their own. Men need to decide on their own. No external factor should tell them, you're not supposed to do this, you're not supposed to do that. You have no business telling people how to live their lives. If this is the arrangement that they chose for themselves, God bless them. It's not for me to say. I don't know if you're aware of this. You may think that there is no polygamy in the Muslim community in America today because, we're civilized. We've evolved. We did not evolve. We're the same exact species that we've been for 200,000 years, right? There is a lot of polygamy in the Muslim community. It's just sad and unregulated. That's why. Because the community looks down upon it. So people still do it. They just do it privately. They do it secretly. They do it without any rules and regulations, right? It's very, very common in the African American community. Very common. It's very, very common in the Afghan community, right? A lot of Afghans, because they, especially the refugees that have come to America in the last 10 years or so, polygamy is the absolute norm for them. This is how things are back home. But when they come here, they do things that are not very lawful, right? And so, for example, if the girl is underage, like back in Afghanistan, it's the norm for them, if both families agree, and the guy is like, whatever, 28, 29, or 30, and he's been married for 10 years, but he wants to take a second wife, so he goes to the family, and she's 16 or 17. That's the perfect norm over there. But if you do this in America, what happens to you? Ooh, the sheriff department's going to be, all over you. And so, just a recent case where a good brother, Hafiz al-Quran, a good brother. I've known this brother for so many years. He married a girl that was 16, and it was just, both families know about it, and there was absolutely, like his wife knew about it. It's within their community and their culture, it was perfectly fine. And then the girl got pregnant. He was I think, traveling for Umrah. And then the girl was pregnant. So she goes to the hospital. She doesn't know that she's pregnant. And then the doctors, they realize that she's pregnant. Oh my God, what's your date of birth? She's an underage. Ooh, who's the father? And this poor girl, she doesn't really know. So she says, my husband, so-and-so. Now in California, 16-year-olds can marry with parental consent. But remember, this guy's already married. So this second marriage is not registered. So as far as the state is concerned, this was statutory rape. So the doctors reported it to the sheriff's department, and now there's an arrest warrant on this guy. And when he arrived from Umrah like a couple of weeks later, he's literally driving on the freeway, and there is like the helicopter followed him, and then they pulled him over, and then imagine the shock, Like he gets pulled over and then he gets arrested. What did I do? And then you committed rape. Rape? And he got in so much trouble. He got 7 years. He got 7 years, right? So, as spectators of an incident like this, what do we make of this? What do we make of this? The law is the law, right? We have to respect the law, right? But at the same time, what he did was not wrong. Certainly was not immoral, right? It was not haram. It's done with the consent of both families. And so what are we supposed to do as a community, right? Is to work with these families and educate them, about the rights and responsibilities and the laws, and try to find a way to navigate the law of the land and at the same time uphold the values of your deen and do things the right way. Or, again, look the other way, shrug, and just call men pigs and say, why are they doing this in the first place? Right? Because that seems that what most of us are doing. And that is not a solution, and it's not helping, right? And on the one hand, we may have an issue with polygamous relationships. But how do we feel about infidelity? How do we feel about zina? How do we feel about 50% of Muslim families end up in a divorce now because of acts of infidelity and cheating? What do we say about that? Why are men being pigs? Okay. If that statement is helping you, absorb this and feel better about it, then sure. But I think as a community and as leadership and inspired by the Quran, we have to think of more difficult solutions, and we have to swallow the pill, and we have to understand that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala did not state this in the Quran in vacuum. Right? These are the biological and social realities of the world that will not change because we don't like them, because we feel bad about them. Right? But then there's one last thing in this ayah that I did not address last time, right? And that is when Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ. You think that everything I said before was difficult on the wasp's nest? Wait until you hear about this one. I'm going to offend every single last sensibility that you have today, right? I will exhaust all of your sensibilities today, and I'll make you very, very angry and upset, but hopefully, inshallah ta'ala, it'll also help you understand. So the Quran says, if you are fearful that you might not be able to be fair to your wives, then stick to one, or مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ, what your right hands possess, right? Some modern translators, because they are trying to be politically correct, they say, oh, no, you're right. What your right hands possess really means your wives. No, it doesn't. That's not what it means. And this is one of those areas where I really disagree with Muhammad Asad on, because, Muhammad Asad, I love his scholarship and I love his story. And his translation of the Quran, I think, is, in my opinion, one of the best that ever written. Because you have this Western convert, who came to Islam, lived 30 years of his life in the Muslim world, Saudi Arabia and Turkey and Egypt and Pakistan and so forth. He's considered to be the ideological father, of the modern, state of Pakistan, right? But at the same time, as much as I love and appreciate, Muhammad Asad's scholarship, and of course his translation of the Quran is very popular, The Message of the Quran, it's called. Muhammad Asad categorically rejects the notion of slavery in Islam, or men having intimate relations with their slaves, and all this concept is completely rejected from Muhammad Asad. So he, I think, pushes the letters of the Quran a little bit too far beyond their boundaries. Now, if you're interested in that particular type of perspective, you can go ahead. But I would rather be true to the historical realities, and I will never apologize for the Quran. I will never apologize for the rules of the deen. If you don't like it, that's your problem, right? My job is to explain and not to apologize or defend, right? If your judgment is going up against the judgment of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, then you need to question your judgment and not the judgment of Allah Azza wa Jal, right? And so there is a reality in the Islamic tradition, and that is slavery is not legal, right? Oh, no, let me rephrase that. There is a reality where that slavery is not illegal. rather. I said slavery is legal. No. The reality is that slavery in Islam is not illegal. It's not illegal, right? It's looked down upon. It's supposed to be dried out. It's supposed to be eliminated. Freeing slaves is a great virtue. The Prophet ﷺ himself encouraged the Muslims and the Ummah and the believers to free slavery. The aspiration of Islam ultimately is to reach a point where society is made of free men and women, right? That is the aspiration of the Quran. However, the Quran always fell an inch short of saying that slavery is wrong, or slavery is illegal, or slavery is haram. There's that little margin of permissibility that is always there. And that kind of drives people crazy because they say, oh, we understand that Islam doesn't like slavery, but why didn't God just say it's haram? Why couldn't He just eliminate the whole thing by just, a strike of a pen? And you would have been wrong. But why are we keep dancing around the fire and we keep saying, oh, slavery is bad, slavery is wrong, it's supposed to stop, Islam dried out its sources and everything. Sure, but why didn't we just say it was haram? It's a thing of the past. It's an ancient institution. I will address that, inshallah ta'ala. There are two things that we need to talk about. Number one, we need to talk about slavery, and within the context of slavery, men having intimate relations with their slave girls, because this is a really important topic. And then there is the other topic of why slavery in general, whether men or women, is not outlawed in the Islamic tradition, right? And so this ayah is focused on the first point. And I don't know if I have time to cover both. This ayah focuses on the legitimacy of men having intimate relations with their slave girls or their female slaves outside the institution of marriage. They're not married to those girls, right? There has not been a case, I think, for hundreds and hundreds of years where Muslim men had intimate relations with slave girls, except when ISIS was taking the Yazidis captive in Iraq. And so this kind of brought this matter to light again. Because these extremists were taking towns, and then they were taking some. The Yazidis is sort of like it's a separate religious group, minority religious group in Iraq, and they have really interesting ancient beliefs. But they focused on the Yazidis because in Islam you cannot take a Muslim as captive. Period. Right. The captive of war has to be non-Muslim. So ISIS would take some of those girls and then they would treat them like they're slave girls, and they would have intimate relationships with them and so forth, and they would have sexual access to those girls. And that really created massive headlines all over the world in the last 10 years. And it's certainly something that makes Islam look bad. And it's certainly something that makes Muslims look bad. Look at your Quran, look at your Islamic tradition, as if what ISIS did is representative of us. The point is that for hundreds and hundreds of years, Muslims have already come to terms with the idea that, alhamdulillah, slavery was abolished. That was the objective of the Quran. That was the objective of the deen, right? But why was slavery abolished by the actions of history rather the letter of law? It would have been easier for the Quran or for the Hadith to say that slavery is illegal, and that would have ended the institution right then and there. So I need to address that question. I don't know if I can do that today, maybe at a different session. But at least the first question, which has to do with sexual access to female slaves, that is relevant to tonight's conversation, or today's conversation. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says in ayah number 3, فَإِنْ خِفْتُمْ أَلَّا تَعْدِلُوا فَوَاحِدَةً أَوْ مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ. If you are fearful that you're not going to be fair to your wives, then stick to one, or مَا مَلَكَتْ أَيْمَانُكُمْ, what your right hands possess. Let me describe to you the social reality when Islam came, right? So Islam came to a world that did not have rules, that did not have laws, that did not have regulations, particularly in marriage, especially in society, but more urgently in warfare, right? There were absolutely no rules of warfare, rules of engagement, right? And of course, I always say that regulating these difficult realities was Islam's genius. Okay, that it did not ignore it, and it did not allow men to just come up with their own man-made secular laws. It addressed it, and it addressed it effectively, right? So the Quran did not stay silent about those matters, and it did not ignore those tough conversations, and it did not sell people fluff. All right. Now, in times of war, what normally happened? Right. You have two armies of men that are fighting each other, and there is territories that are being disputed. This is how international borders and international relations were created. Right. And so, if let's say that there's Army A and Army B, right, and they're fighting each other, and here's country A and there's country B. The army of country A end up winning the day, and they defeated the army of country B. What is going to happen to the people that live in the country B? You know, all these soldiers are going to come in, they will descend upon those towns, they will lay waste to those towns, they will destroy buildings, they will destroy crop, they will destroy trees, they will burn, you know, livestock, you know, they will murder every single male in that community, right? Any man of age that can carry arm, that person would be murdered. Or men would just flee the city, and then because they are either in the army, so they're going to fight another battle, or they just ran away, right? Now, who still remains in those cities? Women, okay? What's going to happen to women and children, and that's children, boys and girls? What's going to happen to women and those children? In pre-Islamic times, there was absolutely no regulation. You know, it was considered a loot of war. And so soldiers that enter the city first get to have the possessions and the property in that city, whether it's land, you know, houses, whatever that is left, you know, from possessions, you know, livestock, horses, you know, carriages, carts, jewelry, clothes, furniture, anything that, and of course weapons, right? Anything that belonged to the enemy becomes mine, right? Including what? Including human beings. That is considered a loot of war. And by the way, Islam regulated the spoils of war as well. Soldiers could not just take land. The land belonged to the state. And soldiers could not just take houses and crops, you know, at will. Islam regulated the spoils of war so that soldiers could take actual items that are left by the soldiers in the theater of battle. See the difference? And I didn't even talk about women. I'm just talking about spoils of war in general. You can't have their homes, you can't have their land, you can't have their date palms. No. You can have their sword, you can have their shield, you can have whatever items that they left in the field of battle and ran away. And even then, the spoils of war need to be divided by how many? How many shares? 5 shares, right? And 1 share needs to go where? To the Prophet ﷺ when he was alive, or after that, you know, that has to go to the central government, right? To Baytul Mal. And so even the spoils of war that are left in the field of battle are not, you know, just taken by everyone like in free reign. That also has to be regulated. And the soldier could not just take it and go home with it. No. You have to collect everything, and then you have to take it back to the central government, and then it's assessed and appraised, and then your share is going to be given to you after the assessment is made, right? It was super heavy regulation. Why? Why was this necessary? Because in ancient times, it was the incentive of theft and stealing from the enemy what drove the soldiers to fight. Oh, you know, you're going to have all the women you want, you can have their houses, you're going to have the weapons, you can have the jewelry, you can have the land, you're going to become like a landlord, you're going to own an estate. So the soldier would be willing to sacrifice their own life or put their own life in danger. But because that is not supposed to be the incentive for which we fight for ideals, we fight for values, right? We fight for the akhirah. We don't fight for wealth. So wealth becomes a secondary sort of like cherry on top. You have to deliver everything, and that's why, you know, you hear stories about the soldiers when they entered the city of Madain in Persia, you know, when Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas was leading the army, and then Umar radiallahu anhu in Medina, he's seeing like all these caravans carrying the treasure chests of Kisra, you know, the king of the Persians, and all the spoils and the loot of the city of Madain. And Umar himself, and he's a calm, collected guy, he looked and he was shocked at the amount of wealth that came back. Inna qawman addu hadha la umana. Soldiers that would deliver all these spoils are trustworthy. But that's how Muslim soldiers were, right? So in normal warfare in pre-Islamic times, everything was free reign. Everything was accessible. The soldier goes and whatever they can grab, they grab. With us, it was very heavily regulated. The Quran heavily regulated it. But with other soldiers, they just go, they grab everything. And they certainly grab women as well. I mean, you're talking about, let's say, there's an army of, 5,000 men. And then they enter a city. And that city, let's say, is a population of, 30, 40,000 people. Half of those people are men, so the men are gone. How many women still remain in that city? Like 15, 20,000 men. 15, 20,000 women still remain in the city. And then you have 5,000 soldiers entering the city. What do you think is going to happen? What do you think did happen in every single battle, right? The soldiers would take all of those women as property. They're all enslaved. They're all exploited. Many of them will get tortured. Many of them will get murdered. Many of them will be sold, right? And because it's only 5 soldiers and you have 20,000 women, so they can't possibly have all of them. So the other women would do what in order to survive? What could they possibly do in order to survive? Sell themselves into prostitution. They would sell themselves into prostitution. Or worse, they would sell their own children into prostitution. They would sell their own boys into slavery because, what could we do in order to survive? That is the social reality that conquered nations had to face. It was actually customary in ancient times that powerful men, if they felt that they are about to be defeated, that they would murder their own families. It was actually quite customary. They would murder their wives, they would murder their children, because the notion is, I would rather that I take their lives with my own hands than to allow the enemy to exploit my wife and my children and to take them as slaves. I couldn't possibly allow this, right? So we were not faced with a rosy reality that Islam came to corrupt. It was an extremely painful reality that Islam needed to regulate, that Islam needed to temper. But that tempering would never happen if I told the soldiers you can't touch any woman in that community either. Because these are long campaigns that lasted for years. I don't know if you guys have been following the news. This movie that is about to be released, the Odyssey, right? So the story of the Odyssey, from Homer's, epic, right? The story of the Odyssey is that the king of Ithaca, Odysseus, who was participating in the Trojan Wars, and his entire army was wiped out. So he's traveling back home to Ithaca in a small cohort of his soldiers, and then he's traveling for 10 years. So the campaign took 10 years, and then he's traveling back, and it's taking him 10 years. Every single member of his party was wiped out. And so the story of Odysseus, right, it explores, homecoming, it explores, making difficult decisions in tough times. It explores the ethics of war, internal turmoil. I'm actually looking forward, because this is one of the few modern depictions of the Odyssey. And I read the book, and the Odyssey is a poem, right, that describes what happened to, in this fictional story, what happened to Odysseus on his way home. 20 years. These guys are away from their families. What do you think is going to happen to young soldiers who have been far from their wives and their homes for 5, 10 years at a time? What do you think is going to happen? Like, we can pretend that they're going to be nice. Like I said, we can come up with our own statements about it. Right? These are men who are charged by war, they're charged by longing, they're charged by blood, and engaging in warfare actually increases the level of steroids in their blood. What do you think is going to happen when they enter a city of vulnerable women? Yeah, we can look the other way and say, inshallah, they're not going to be pigs. But, only Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala knows, the type of temptation that a man like this faces at that moment. So even Muslim soldiers, it would have been impossible for us to say, no, you can't touch any of these women. Atrocities would have still happened, and we would have spent centuries in futile forms of law enforcement that would have never fixed the problem. Right? So the solution was, there has to be regulations here. Right? Now, if you take a woman, that woman has to be treated like your wife. You don't call her a slave either. The Prophet ﷺ, discouraged the believers from using the word abd and ama, right? The Prophet ﷺ would use the word fata, my boy, my daughter, my girl, right? Fata. You have to take her, and she has to become your wife, like your wife, right? She's not the legal status of your wife, but she has to be treated like your wife, right? Number two, you have to support her financially, right? Number three, you have to clothe her, you have to provide her with shelter, and the minute you have intimate access to this woman, in the majority of scholarship, she cannot be sold to anybody else. And if you die and she's with you, she will automatically become free. And all of her children will also become free as well. And if you make a single mistake and she complained to the government will enforce manumission against your will. She will be liberated, right? And if none of this is enough, this particular woman that was taken as captive and now lives with you, if she doesn't like you and she doesn't like this life anymore, what can she do in order to rectify her own situation? She can apply for zakah funds. One of the 8 channels of spending zakah is what? وَفِي الرِّقَابِ. What is وَفِي الرِّقَابِ? People who are in bondage, who are enslaved, and they would like to emancipate themselves. So they go to the government and they apply. The government is required to give them enough money for them to free themselves. And so the woman and her captive, they would agree on a proper market value, and if he inflates the value, she can go and litigate. She can go to the court and say, no, he's making it difficult, he's making it prohibitive. So they would decide in this particular market, it's 200 dirhams. And the government would give her the money, and then she would give that money to this person and say, I'm a free woman now, I don't want to live with you, right? This was Islam's way of addressing, all of this in order to not ignore the practical, biological, difficult realities that would happen in times of war, but at the same time, make sure that there is a process by which those women are liberated and are freed. Okay? When we use the word slave, by the way, today, we always use the word slave in the context of, transatlantic, slave trade, which was one of the most horrific experiences of slavery in the entire history, right? So the word slave is, kunta kinte comes to mind right away. And that is inaccurate when we talk about slavery in the Muslim world. And I strongly recommend, if you want to read more about slavery in Islam and slavery in Islamic law, read Jonathan Brown's book, Slavery in Islam, right? Jonathan Brown is a Muslim scholar. He's out of Georgetown. He's really one of the foremost scholars of hadith in America today, right? Him and I went to grad school together. He was in the PhD program, I was in the master's program. But he has multiple books that I think you should read all of them, right? Misquoting Muhammad is an incredible book of his. Slavery in Islam, like literally go on Amazon, buy those 2 books right away. They're available, in electronic format. Slavery in Islam is a bit of a read, but I think it'll answer all of your questions, about slavery, manumission, emancipation, having sexual relations with female slaves, the Prophet ﷺ, having Ibrahim with Maria, the Egyptian, who was not his wife, by the way. She was also a slave. All of that, I think, is addressed extensively and answered, in this book. So, instead of allowing prostitution, rape, murder, and full exploitation of women with absolutely zero right, Islam instituted practical rules and regulations that would minimize the impact. Remember, those communities, they've already lost the war. They've already lost the war. That's a reality. We're sorry for them, but they've already lost the war. That puts them automatically in this very, very difficult, precarious position. And so, considering that reality, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in Surat Al-Nisa, and in other parts of the Quran, created those rules and boundaries in order to regulate, these events. Again, I have to state what I said earlier, and that is the ultimate goal of the Quran was to eliminate slavery. That was always the intention of the Quran. It was always the desire of the Prophet ﷺ, is to live in a world where men and women are free. But then again, war will always make that dream difficult to achieve. Okay? And so whenever war happens and these exploitations can take place, the Quran steps in with those difficult regulations in order to make sure that exploitation does not happen. Right? And I want to state one last thing here before I move on to the next point, and that is, in Islam, the only legitimate source of enslaving someone is warfare. Like in other cultures, like in India, for example, people who were in debt, if you cannot pay off your debt, what can you do to fix the situation? Sell yourself to your debtor, the person that is owed money. So I cannot pay you money, but I will become your slave. Temporarily or permanently, that depends on the agreement, right? Okay, you're going to be my temporary slave for 5 years until you've worked, labored hard enough in order to pay me back. Or, I will have you for life, kind of thing. And that person would have no choice. Slavery also came, from captivity. Like the Arabs, remember the story of Zayd radiallahu anhu? He was taken as a captive when he was traveling with his family in a caravan across the desert, and he was sold as a slave, right? So that was also a common path by which free people were made slaves. In Islam, the only legitimate path is warfare, right? And again, that was Islam's way of minimizing or drying out the sources of slavery. Of course, there's an image that comes to mind, right, from ancient times, maybe from Ottoman times, or with the harem, right, al-harim, right, the harem is just all these women and all these nights of pleasures and lusts, where men are surrounded by all these slave girls, dancing for them, and drinking alcohol, and singing and stuff like that. There's that image that comes to mind, all multiple slaves and debauchery and lust and decadence. None of this is from Islam. None of it would be sanctioned by the deen. It's all haram. These are horrific practices that people who happen to be Muslim engaged with. Right? This has nothing to do with slavery. This has nothing to do with Islamic teachings. This just has to do with those people and what they chose to do. And then we go into ayah number 4. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَآتُوا النِّسَاءَ صَدُقَاتِهِنَّ نِخْلًا, and give women their dowries as a free gift. What used to happen also in marriages in pre-Islamic times is that sometimes men would do a swap, okay? So let's say, not the wife swap, from the reality shows, right, that you have. I'm telling you, like a lot of those pre-Islamic Jahiliyyah practices are really still practiced today, which is, super ironic in our civilized modern society, right? But the point is, they used to practice a different type of swap, where a wali or a wakil would have a daughter under their care that is not their own daughter, or sometimes, she was, but most of the time it's not their daughter. It could be like an orphan girl or somebody else's daughter that he is the wakil for, and sometimes it's his daughter. And then they would go and find someone else that is also a wakil for another girl, and they will say, I'll give you the daughter that I'm a wali for, and then you're going to give me the daughter that you are the wali for, and then we just, I marry your girl, and then you marry my girl, right? And then there would be no dowry or mahr exchange. Why? Because it kind of it becomes like a wash. Like, why give you $5,000 and then you give me $5,000? Let's just call it a day, and I'm not going to give you anything, you're not going to give me anything. Whose opinion is ignored in all of this? The girls, right? They did not consent to any of this. What if she doesn't want to marry this old creep, right? But then, she's forced into this because consent was not a requirement in pre-Islamic times. Dowry went entirely to the wakil, right? To the legal guardian, and not to the girl herself. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala here says, وَآتُوا النِّسَاءَ صَدُقَاتِهِنَّ, give women their dowry. She keeps her dowry, not her father, not her family. She's supposed to be the one to get the dowry, and then she can decide on her own. فَإِن طِبْنَ لَكُمْ عَنْ شَيْءٍ مِنْهُ نَفْسًا فَكُلُوهُ هَنِيئًا مَرِيئًا. If she agreed to give her family some of that dowry, some of that mahar, then that's her choice. She could do that if she wanted to. But she cannot be, number one, she cannot be forced to marry someone. Number two, she cannot be married off to someone in some kind of a swap. Number three, she cannot be married without dowry. Number four, the dowry has to be hers and not her wakil. Right? Again, this is correcting a lot of these pre-Islamic practices that used to be very, very common and very, very prevalent. And then ayah number 5 addresses something else. Remember, in Surah Al-Nisa, we were talking about vulnerable groups. We're talking about minority groups, minority by numbers or minority by rights, because women were not a minority by number, but they were certainly a minority in pre-Islamic times by the scarcity of their rights. So Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala talks about another category now of vulnerable groups, which is the category of as-sufaha, right? وَلَا تُؤْتُوا السُّفَهَاءَ أَمْوَالَكُمْ. Sufaha is a really interesting word, right? Because sufaha is the plural of safih. And safih is what? What comes to mind when we say safih? Stupid. Yeah, maybe, right? Maybe stupid comes to mind. Unwise. Maybe someone who's a little bit delayed, like retarded in their mental growth. I know that this has become so politically incorrect to say in this day and age, but I'm just saying it linguistically as it is. Not as a derogatory term. It's not a cuss word, right? If someone is delayed in their cognitive development, then that person would be considered safih in the Islamic legal terminology. And therefore, that person should not, if that person is an orphan and is raised in your household and that person is owned inheritance from their parents, if you give this person at the age of 14 or 15, $500,000, what do you think is going to do with this money? They don't have an understanding of how to spend money or how to invest money or how to not act foolishly with money. But then it also becomes a difficult question. How do we decide on who a safih is? Like, who gets to decide? Like, half of the parents, they think that their kids are safih. Right? Like, what if the legal guardian has a vested interest in assuming that this person, this orphan, is a safih in order to avoid giving them the money? Oh, no, I'm not giving them money right now. They're retarded. Right? I am not. They're not ready. And then they're 25 years of age, and look at them. They're definitely not ready. And so Islam also the scholars came up with really objective criteria to decide on who a safih is, right? So the scholars either said that the safih is someone who is underage, meaning that person has not reached puberty yet, like a child. I think we can always agree that children should not be given the capacity to spend money on their own without, the intervention or the guidance of a legal guardian. I think that even today, I think, it's funny because like the what do you call it? Financial personhood in America is what? Is at the age of 18. Prior to 18, you cannot consent, you cannot sign, you cannot unless, a legal guardian signs on your behalf. All right, and so Islam actually had an earlier age of financial personhood, which was like, puberty-ish. For girls, it would be like, 10 to 12 or whatever. For boys, it would be like 12 to 14, depending on. And so that is objective enough. If this orphan child that lives in my household has not reached puberty yet, then that person is still a safih, right? That's pretty objective. Or maybe through the verification of the entire community or the imam or the judge or a local physician that says that this person is delayed in their mental capacity or their cognitive abilities, right? Then that person is considered safih, in accordance with the legal definition of the word, in which case that person does not have access to that wealth, right? Or maybe that person is just outright majnoon, like someone who is permanently mentally disabled, and that person will never be normal. In which case, the Quran again says, وَلَا تُؤْتُوا السُّفَهَاءَ أَمْوَالَكُمْ. We understand that you're trying to be pious, but your piety cannot lead you to wastage. If you give wealth to someone who is majnoon, they have no legal capacity whatsoever or mental capacity to spend that money. So you'd actually be harming them if you do something like this. Shafi'i has a really interesting definition of what safih is. Shafi'i says someone who got into their safah, right? Their foolishness is demonstrable by them getting into trouble with the law. Like that person did such unwise things that they were now prosecuted by the law, right? وَقَعَ عَلَيْهِ حُكْمٌ مِّنَ الْإِمَامِ, he would say. There is, that person has broken some rules, and you and I might say, it actually makes sense. Someone who commits a crime that is both haram and illegal and defies the cultural norms of their society, that sounds like foolishness to us, right? And so if someone falls in this category, Shafi'i says that would be considered a safih, even if they're an adult, which is really fascinating, right? Until that person has repented and there's a track record, of that person, whatever, serving their time, and now the society can vouch for this person, in which case you have to give them their wealth. Now, until then, until you give them their wealth that is owed to them, it says, وَارْزُقُوهُمْ فِيهَا وَاكْسُوهُمْ. You can use that wealth to provide for them, you can use that wealth to clothe them, you can use that wealth to feed them. That is legitimate. وَقُولُوا لَهُمْ قَوْلًا مَعْرُوفًا. And still use good words as you treat them, and offer them an honest advice. Ayah number 6 is a continuation of this, right? Now the time needs to come for us to give them their wealth, right? So it says, وَابْتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغُوا النِّكَاحَ فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا فَادْفَعُوا إِلَيْهِمْ أَمْوَالَهُمْ. Test the orphans by asking them the right questions, by observing their behavior, by seeing how their good judgment is. Some of the scholars actually say you test them by giving them a little bit of money and seeing how they spend that money, right? So, وَابْتَلُوا الْيَتَامَى, test the orphans, حَتَّى إِذَا بَلَغُوا النِّكَاحَ, when they reach the age where they can get married, which is the age of puberty. فَإِنْ آنَسْتُم مِّنْهُمْ رُشْدًا. See, that's the other thing. The Arabs, before Islam and the Quran adopted this. There is Sinnul Bulugh, the age of puberty, and then there is Sin al-Rushd. And what is al-Rushd? Is the age of? Yeah, the age of mental development, or the age of mental wisdom. Because not everyone that reached puberty has rushd or has wisdom in them, right? So both need to be judged. We have to make sure that you've reached puberty, and then we have to make sure that you've reached the age of rushd, like Rashid, like someone who has good judgment, someone who can make good decisions with money. So it's not just boom, that person reached puberty, they can get married right away. No, you have to have some rushd in you as well. In which case you can both get married and be entitled to your wealth from your legal guardian, right? Was that a question? Or a comment, please?
Does that apply to just inheritance or marriage as well? That same as the age of relevance in addition to puberty.
Remember, all of this is left for the legal guardians to decide. We're not talking to the child. We're talking to the legal guardian. We're talking to the wali. And so one of the requirements of walaya, if you're the wali of a girl particularly, and I will address if it's a boy, is that you are the one that decides whether your daughter is ready to get married or not. And if she tells you, if she's in high school and she tells you, Dad, I love Abdullah, he's in my class, he's a really good kid, he wants to marry me, you can just tell her, what the heck are you talking about? You're 14, okay? We're not gonna have this conversation until you are 18 and you're in college. Maybe we can talk about it then. Your job, and that's why in all the madhahib, the wali is a requirement for the validation of the nikah. So if a girl goes and gets married on her own, as far as Islam is concerned, that's zina. Her marriage is null and void in accordance with Islamic law. Only Abu Hanifa made an exception to this when he said that, الثَّيِّبُ وَلِيَّةُ نَفْسِهَا. A woman that has been married before, she can be a wali for herself, and that is not the entirety of the Hanafi madhab, by the way. It's because even if she's 35 years old and she's been married before, she still needs someone else's advice so that she doesn't emotionally rush into a marriage or a relationship. And sometimes, taking a little time, consulting with your wali, and him making some phone calls and calling the guy's local imam that will tell him this is a terrible person, don't do it. She's not going to do any of that due diligence, right? So even then, I think that the walaya is still, a requirement. So in the affairs of marriage, when this person is an underage, it is an absolute requirement, and also in financial affairs, it is still an absolute requirement. So it's the legal guardian that is making the decision here, whether they give that person, their money or not. Now, your question also implied that you're asking about a boy who reached puberty and is thinking about marriage, and this boy does not need the permission of their wali, right? However, that may be true at face value, but remember, this conversation involves the consent of not just the person or the family. It involves a conversation that is much wider, that includes the society and culture and certain norms that must be met and addressed. And I'm going to talk about this a little bit more in the context of a nation state, right? Because this is really important, and this is actually my last thought here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, وَلَا تَأْكُلُوهَا إِسْرَافًا وَبِدَارًا أن يكبروا. Do not consume the wealth of this orphan child extravagantly and hastily, lest they attain to full age, and whoever is rich, let him abstain altogether. See, فَلْيَسْتَعْفِفْ, this is a really beautiful command from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala. Even if you are the legal guardian and you have the legal right to use this child's wealth to support them financially and to clothe them and so forth, it's better that you avoid doing that. فَلْيَسْتَعْفِفْ. It's better that you refrain from using their wealth. Leave their wealth alone and spend on them, if you could, from your own money, because it would be better for you. وَمَنْ كَانَ فَقِيرًا فَلْيَأْكُلْ بِالْمَعْرُوفِ. If you don't have the financial means, then it's okay to access some of that wealth and use it to support the child and to support the family as well. And I want to end here with a thought that I alluded to earlier, and that is the context under which Sharia operates is not the modern context of the modern nation state. Okay, and I iterate that once again. The modern context of the nation state makes us where we are all dependent on the central government. We're all dependent on them for our IDs, for our taxes, for our highways, for our employment. We're dependent on them for the right of transportation. You have to get a passport in order to travel. The government tells you whether you leave the border or not. Well, dude, it's my home. Why are you taxing my house? I own it, right? But the government exercises the right to tax you. The government exercises the right to enforce the law, the right to, in many cases, we live in America in this illusion of the separation of powers when powers are really not separated. There's no separate, the government, the executive branch of the government is making laws every single day. I mean, it really is the greatest illusion of all times, that people actually think that the executive power does not make laws. The executive power may not necessarily make laws similar to the laws of Congress, but the executive power makes laws every single day. Do you think that democracy set the legal speed limit? There is 95% of the laws that you're under today are designated by the unelected officials of county and city and the executive power. Right? The governor makes decisions every single day that impact our lives. The president makes executive decisions every single day, makes decisions about spending on foreign policy, makes decisions about war. You and I have absolutely, and those decisions carry the weight of law. So there is no separation in that particular regard. The legislature and the judiciary are in constant cahoots, right? There is no separation of powers anymore. And so you and I are still beholden to the power of the modern nation state in every aspect of our lives, that it almost feels like we're enslaved by the modern nation state. And the opposite is also true. It's only the nation state that has the power to exercise force. It's only the nation state that has the power to tell you whether you can carry arms or not, or what type of arm, right? California will hyper-regulate your weapons and will tell you exactly, the length of the muzzle and whether or not your gun stock, it can be adjustable. It's absolutely ridiculous, right? And the government will also exercise the right to kill you. If you are on death row and the government deems that you need to be executed, the government will execute you. All the services, everything is rendered and provided by the government. Social norms are now provided by the government. Which website is allowed and which app is allowed. When they decided to shut down TikTok, they shut down TikTok until an American investor bought it, right? Who's this horrible human being, the guy from Oracle. My point is, Sharia law assumes that the responsibility of living a good life resides in the hands of the family and the local community. Sharia law leaves matters of warfare and matters of general welfare of society in the hands of the government. But almost everything else needs to be regulated and needs to be executed by the local community. And that's why Sharia law aspires for the most decentralized system imaginable. I mean, think of America 250 years ago. And by the way, this coming 4th of July is America's 250th anniversary, which I think needs to stir all kinds of conversations. This is a quarter century, a quarter millennium of America. And I think examining that legacy is going to be really important. We have some podcast ideas to talk about this, inshallah. But the point is, that's in this modern reality, where America 150 years ago used to be super decentralized, right? You had the federal government who had nothing to do with the affairs of the states, and the state has nothing to do with the affairs of the township or the county, and the county leaves the city alone, and the city for the most part was just completely out of your business. Now we live in a reality where the city penetrates every single aspect, the state penetrates every single aspect of your existence and regulates and hyper-regulates every aspect of your existence. And so I always say that in order for Sharia law to be fully implemented in its most optimum state, it needs to be implemented in a decentralized system where local authorities, including the family and including the local community, the local imams, the local council of elders and all of that, those are the authorities that ensure that the law is going to be implemented. Because if the police doesn't find you in the modern nation state, if the police doesn't find you, if the law is not enforced, people are going to get away with it. But if we are connected to our families and our local community, the cost of breaking the rules is way too high. Because I'm going to lose my parents, I'm going to lose my family, I'm going to lose my friends, I will lose every memory that I have, I will be ostracized, I will be an outcast. It's too much of a cost, I don't want to do that. So being in tune with your local customs and traditions and the expectations of family and community was actually the greatest deterrent against crime. As opposed to the modern nation state where people are just, okay, I'll break the rules as long as I think that the cops are not going to get me. The fear of punishment is the only driving factor today. Whereas, historically speaking, Muslims operated, the notion of getting punished by the government was actually the least of my concerns. My biggest concern is all these people, my friends and family and local community and local leaders and the chief of the tribe and all of these people that, the cost is going to be severe. I don't want to get into that, right? So it is in that context that we are setting these rules, that the norms are and the standards are being defined. That the legal guardian, is not just left to his personal piety, but that person is going to be ostracized, is going to be shamed by the local community if they did not deliver the trust to the orphans. Like these orphans did not have to go to the court and litigate because again, I can just go to the imam and the imam is going to shame these people. They will never do that because it would be very, very costly for them. The conversation, inshallah ta'ala, continues, but I will stop here. And next time we're going to talk about the rules and shares and regulations of inheritance. So that too will be very, very exciting / controversial. And we love those things. So I will take some of your questions, inshallah ta'ala, before we get ready for Salat al-Dhuhr. Yes.
So, according to the Sharia, a girl can be married after she gets the puberty, right? But then the law of the man here is until, so she can be married here with the consent of the parents, but with the same age, under 18 person. I don't think she can be married, or am I wrong? I could be wrong. That she can, even with the consent of the parents, underage girl can only be married to the underage boy.
No. So if the girl has sexual relations when she's underage, it, I know it sounds weird, but it needs to be with someone that is also underage like her. You know, so this, neither of them would be, prosecuted for statutory rape.
But then,
But marriage in California, if she is between 16 and 18, she can marry an adult with her parental consent. So she can marry a guy who's 25 years old.
but the guy was, because it was a second marriage, that's why
He could not register the second marriage legally in California because, he would be breaking the law. Polygamy is not allowed in America. So he did the traditional nikah at the masjid without informing the government that he's marrying this girl.
So if the person is married not underage, but over 18, second marriage, but still according to the law, so people are only supposed to be married once there, right? The registered marriage.
Yes and no, because the Mormons created also a legal reality where, because polygamy is not only common, it's required for Mormon men. And so in states like Utah, for example, and other states, where there's a lot of Mormons, they would have one registered marriage, but then they would have many like other unregistered marriages. And the state knows that and, does not address it.
But then if that's the case for Muslims, so everything needs to be divided equally, right? The man, let's say the man has 2 or 3 or 4 wives, he dies.
Correct.
There is only one registered wife, right? So all the wealth will be gone to this wife because she's the registered wife. Who's going to take care of the rights of the other?
So, scholars would say that he would have to take care of all of those matters in his lifetime. So he has to use his wasiyah, his will, in order to allocate wealth properly to the other wife and her children, or maybe put the house in her name in his lifetime. Like he has to go through all the proper Islamic steps to ensure 100% that in the event of his death, no one gets the short end of the stick. And if he doesn't do that, then he's doing something haram. Right.
Another question. When we were talking about the slaves and their rights and everything, and if she wants to buy herself out, or the husband or the person captive dies, she's free, and then the kids are free. You said that. What about when there's a baby is born with a slave? What name is this baby, slave baby, going to get? The father's name?
Absolutely.
Will that baby have a right of, like, the marriage, the other, the wife, his own kids? Will the slave baby have all the same rights?
100%.
In the virasat and everything?
100%. A lot of people, by the way, don't know this. The majority of Abbasi khulafa were sons of slave women.
So they will have
The majority of them. The Abbasi Khalifa would have wives, but he would have access to slave women from Persia, from Armenia, from Georgia, from Turkey, whatever. Many of the Abbasi Khulafa, their mothers were slave women, and they became the Khalifa.
But if that's the case, then why are we still talking about if the captive is dead, then she will be freed, and then the kids will be freed? Because if the kids...
No, the kids will be free the moment they were born.
So they are born free.
They're born free.
So that statement...
But she only becomes free if, some scholars say that she becomes Well, not free, okay? But he cannot sell her to somebody else. Once he has intimate relations with her, he cannot sell her to someone else. And then if he dies, then she automatically becomes free.
And there's a distinction about children who also became enslaved in that process versus children who were born out of that enslavement.
Is that what you're asking, sister, or are you asking about a child that was born?
No, I wasn't. I was just asking about the kids who are born because you said that she will be free and that the kids will be free. I was thinking, why are the kids slaves?
No. I misspoke. The child is born free, but she will only become free once her captive dies, or if he decides to free her, or if she buys herself out, like I said earlier. Yeah.
I have one more question, but I want to give other people.
Yeah, sure.
Is the woman allowed to marry the person after she gives birth to a child or something? Like, can the woman claim her as his legal wife later?
She has to be legally emancipated first, and then he can marry her through a regular nikah process if he wanted to. Or if he doesn't want to, then he liberates her or emancipates her, and then she can now legally marry anybody else that she wanted to marry. But as long as she is still possessed by his right hand, then she can, obviously she is his. She cannot marry somebody else. And she's not required to legally marry him because, she's already his.
To give her like a little bit higher level, like if she's
Exactly. So it's all sentimental. If he loves her so much, they tell the story actually of Sulaiman. I think it was Sulaiman al-Qanuni, Sulaiman the Magnificent of the Ottoman Empire, who fell in love with this. I think she was an Armenian slave of his, and he loved her so much that he eventually freed her and he married her. And he didn't have to do that. Actually, Sulaiman was known to be one of the khulafa of the Ottoman Empire that had the least amount of interest in slave girls, because he loved his wife so much. So that definitely, for the purposes of love, or if you want to elevate her station and just in your lifetime you want to see her as your wife, you have the right to do that, in which case you have to do a fresh nikah with her. Yes?
Two questions. The first one would be, a master is allowed to give a space person to marry someone else, right? I believe.
Say again?
The owner is allowed to give permission to the slave to marry someone else.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes.
Both
Yes.
men and women.
Yeah, you can permit the slave to marry someone, man or woman.
And then
Right.
in the case in which, let's say, there's a woman that's a slave, but she's allowed to marry someone else, the master can no longer
Absolutely cannot touch her. And he cannot let her marry someone else in the first place unless, she was not, touched by him.
Okay.
Yeah.
And then the other question is, if you, because obviously someone can be married and still be a slave. If they're married and sold, is still the new master not do anything with her because she's already married to someone else, right?
Yeah, exactly. She's just labor. She's just sold as a servant or as labor, and he cannot have intimate relations with her. Not legitimately, at least.
Children are all born free.
That is the norm in every single case. The children of slaves are born free the minute they are born, regardless of the circumstances, even if both their parents were slaves. Yes. Wa alaikum salam.
A couple of questions. Who is the you compare country faith with the other faiths, and we know that there's always something in the faiths that are not completely, conforming to Quran and Hadith, or the normal Jewish jurisprudence. My question is then, based on majority opinion or based on the most preferable opinion, who is the wali of widower or the divorcee? Divorced woman. Divorced and widow woman.
There's an order to it in Islamic law. So it would be her father. If her father is not alive, then it would be her brother, her older brother. If her brother is not alive, then it would be her oldest uncle. And if her oldest uncle is not alive, then it would be her grandfather. And if her grandfather is not alive, then it would be her oldest son, and so on and so forth, if they're of age.
Right. And sons.
And in the absence, by the way, of all of these men, like literally she does not have a surviving male relative, then she can go to one of the elders of the community or the imam or whatever in order to become her wali.
It becomes a little problematic. Let's say if a woman is like 38 or 39
So that's a good question. So the wali's job is to provide a woman with the right type of information so that she can make that decision on her own, right? And remember, there is multiple layers here. That the child is probably the last one, right? And so there will always be an uncle, there will always be a brother, there will always be somebody else that is old enough that will make that help her make that decision. So it's not that he decides for her. He provides her with the information, and then she has to decide on her own, and then he blesses that decision. He has to still bless that decision in the end. And remember, even if her son is 17, and let's say that she wanted to marry someone, and then her son is not okay with it. And in that particular situation, her 17-year-old son is her wali. In which case, his final blessing is still required. What do you think is going to happen if she married someone without her son's blessings? There's going to be conflict, there's going to be strife, there's going to be issues, there's going to be fights. The marriage is going to be ruined before it even starts. So the point of the wali is that, and I always say this, by the way, to young couples who are trying to get married and their parents are being sticklers or just saying no for no good reason, I always say, especially to sisters, you still have to be patient. Well, it's just my dad is racist. And he doesn't want me to marry this person because he's from a different culture. I was like, be that as it may. But you still have to be patient. You know why? Because time could be your best solution. Maybe this is Allah's way of telling you need to take it a little bit of time, look at this further, trying to investigate the situation. One of two things is going to happen. It's either you will blink or your dad will blink. Maybe after 6 months you realize, you know what, I don't know. I thought that I liked this guy, but I really don't. He's annoying. It's not worth, having a falling out with my dad over this, right? Or maybe her dad is going to say, well, my daughter really loves this guy. I don't want to ruin her happiness. Therefore, he gives his blessings. Either way, the passage of time was very helpful because it will now set that marriage up for success or prevent it from happening in the first place because it wasn't a good idea. And so even if the wali is a young person, I think she still has to wait, and this is how you ensure harmony in whatever decision that ends up taking place.
What is that?
Okay, I'm not going to use the word blessing. I'm just going to use the word consent then to make sure that,
If a woman
yeah.
is already like 40 or 35, why does she need a wedding? I don't get it. Why does she need a permission?
Well, okay, again, it's not permission. It's that her desire and her wali need to be the same.
Consent.
Yeah, because a woman should not be married against the will of her family anyway.
Why? Or if it's halal? then
Because that is not the type of family that Islam envisions. Islam envisions a harmonious family where you're going to have children, and those children are going to have aunts and uncles and grandpa and grandma, and they need to like each other, and they need...
She's already 40s, and 40 women are already, with the one relationships and blah, blah, blah. But then if she wants to marry, spend her life with somebody she thinks that is going to be a good partner. Like,
Do you guys want me to stop? Is that... Oh, shoot.
oh, you and
I need to be somewhere else. Sister Hina, maybe you and I need to talk about this, offline. But I think I am needed for the Sunday school graduation. Is that? Do you want to talk to Sister Hina separately? Because let me just conclude the program officially. سبحانك اللهم وبحمدك أشهد أن لا إله إلا أنت نستغفرك ونتوب إليك. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم والعصر الإنسان لفي خسر إلا الذين آمنوا وعملوا الصالحات وتواصوا بالحق وتواصوا بالصبر سبحان ربك رب العزة عما يصفون وسلام على المرسلين والحمد لله رب العالمين وصلى الله على محمد وعلى آله وصحبه أجمعين. Sister Hina, there's always the Hanafi perspective if you want to take that.
No, I don't know about Hanafi or I don't know about these, but that's a legit question. I will
maliciously walking things, you can go around.
She can go to the judge. Yeah.
Or to like an imam.